Chapter 20. Be as courageous as you can. If none of us is prepared to die for freedom, then all of us will die under tyranny. Epilogue. History and Liberty. In Shakespeare's drama, Hamlet, the hero is a virtuous man who is rightly shocked by the abrupt rise of an evil ruler. Haunted by visions, overcome by nightmares, lonely and estranged, he feels he must reconstruct his sense of time. The time is out of joint, says Hamlet. O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. Our time is certainly out of joint. We have forgotten history for one reason, and if we are not careful, we will neglect it for another. We will have to repair our own sense of time if we wish to renew our commitment to liberty. Until recently, we have convinced ourselves that there was nothing in the future but more of the same. The seemingly distant traumas of fascism, Nazism, and communism seem to have receded into irrelevance. We allowed ourselves to accept the politics of inevitability, the sense that history could only move in one direction, towards liberal democracy. After communism in Eastern Europe came to an end in 1988 to 91, we imbibed the myth of the end of history. In doing so, we lowered our defences and constrained our imaginations and opened the way for precisely the kinds of regimes we told ourselves could never return. To be sure, politics of inevitability seems at first glance to be a kind of history. Inevitability politicians do not deny that there is a past, a present, and a future. They even allow for a colourful variety of distant pasts. Yet they portray the present simply as a step towards the future that we already know, one of expanding globalization, deepening reason, and growing prosperity. Teleology, a narration of time that leads towards a certain, usually desirable goal. Communism also offered a teleology, promising the inevitable social utopia. When that story was shattered a quarter of a century ago, we drew the wrong conclusions. Rather than rejecting teleologies, we imagined that our own story was true. The politics of inevitability is a story of self-induced intellectual coma. So long as there was a contest between communism and capitalist systems, and so long as the memory of fascism and Nazism was alive, Americans had to pay some attention to history and preserve the concepts that allowed them to imagine alternative futures. Yet once we accepted the politics of inevitability, we assumed that history was no longer relevant. If everything in the past is governed by a knowing tendency, then there is no need to learn the details. The acceptance of inevitability stilted the way we talked about politics in the 21st century. It stifled policy debates and tended to generate party systems that were one political party defending the status quo while the other proposed total negation. We learned to say that there was no alternative to the basic order of things, a sensibility that the Lithuanian political theorist Leonidis Donskic called liquid evil. Once inevitability was taken for granted, criticism indeed became slippery. What appeared to be critical analysis often assumes that the status quo could not actually change and thereby indirectly reinforced it. Some spoke critically of neoliberalism, the sense that the idea of the free market has somehow crowded out all others. This was true enough, but the very use of the word was usually a kowtow before an unchangeable hegemony. Other critics spoke of the need for disruption, borrowing a term from analysis of technological innovation. When applied to politics, it again carries the implications that nothing can really change, that the chaos that excites us will eventually be absorbed by a self-regulating system. The man who runs naked across a football field certainly disrupts, but he does not change the rules of the game. The whole notion of disruption is adolescent. It assumes that after the teenager makes a mess, the adults will come and clean it up. But there are no adults. We own this mess. The second anti-historical way of considering the past is politics of eternity. Like the politics of inevitability, the politics of eternity performs a masquerade of history, though a different one. It is concerned with the past, but in a self-absorbed way, free of any real concern with facts. Its mood is a longing for the past moment that never really happened, during epochs that were, in fact, disastrous. Eternity politicians bring us the past as a vast, misty courtyard of illegible moments to national victimhood, all of them equally distant from the present, all of them equally accessible for manipulation. Every reference to the past seems to invoke an attack by some external enemy upon the purity of the nation. National populists are eternity politicians. They prefer reference points in eras when democratic republics seemed vanquished and their Nazi and Soviet rivals unstoppable, the 1930s. Those who advocated Brexit, the departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union, imagined a British national state, though such a thing never existed. There was a British Empire, then there was Britain as a member of the European Union. The move to separate from the European Union is not a step backwards onto firm ground, but a leap into the unknown. Eerily, when judges said that the parliamentary vote was required for Brexit, a British tabloid called them the enemies of the people, a Stalinist term from show trials of the 1930s. The National Front in France urges voters to reject Europe in the name of an imaginary pre-war France nation-state. But France, like Britain, has never existed without either an empire or the European project. Leaders of Russia, Poland, Hungary alike make similar gestures towards glowing images of the 1930s. In his 2016 campaign, the former American president used the slogan, America First, which is the name of the committee that sought to prevent the United States from opposing Nazi Germany. The president's strategic advisor promised policies that were as exciting as the 1930s. When exactly was the again in the president's slogan, Make America Great Again? Hint, it is the same again that we find in Never Again. The former president himself described a regime change in the style of the 1930s as the solution to the problems of the present. You know what it solves? When the economy crashes, when the country goes to total hell and everything is a disaster. What we need, he thinks, rights to go back to where we used to be, when we were great. In the politics of eternity, the seduction by mythicized pasts prevents us from thinking about possible futures. The habit of dwelling on victimhood dulls the impulse of self-correction, since the nation is defined by an inherent virtue rather than by future potential. Politics becomes a discussion of good and evil rather than a discussion of possible solutions to real problems. Since the crisis is permanent, the sense of emergency is always present. Planning for the future seems impossible or even disloyal. How can we ever think of reform when the enemy is always at the gates? If the politics of inevitability is like a coma, the politics of eternity is like a hypnosis. We stare at the spinning vortex of a cyclical myth until falling into a trance, and then we do something shocking at someone else's orders. The danger we are now facing is of a passage from the politics of inevitability to the politics of eternity, from a naive to a flawed sort of democratic republic, to a confused and cynical sort of fascist oligarchy. The politics of inevitability is terribly vulnerable to a kind of shock it has just received. When something shatters the myth, when our time falls out of joint, we scramble to find some other way to organize what we experience. The path of least resistance leads directly from inevitability to eternity. If you once believe that everything always turns out well in the end, you can be persuaded that nothing turned out well in the end. If you once did nothing because you thought that progress is inevitable, then you can continue to do nothing because you think time moves in repeated cycles. Both of these positions, inevitability and eternity, are anti-historical. The only thing that stands between them is history itself. History allows us to see patterns and make judgments. It sketches for us the structures between which we can seek freedom. It reveals moments, each one of them different, none entirely unique. To understand one moment, it is to see the possibility of being co-creator of another. History permits us to be responsible, not for everything, but for some things. The Polish poet Mr. Milos thought that such a notion of responsibility worked against loneliness and indifference. History gives us company of those who have done and suffered more than we have. By embracing the politics of inevitability, we raised a generation without history. How will the young Americans react now that the promises of inevitability have been obviously broken? Perhaps they will slide from inevitability towards eternity. It must be hoped that they could instead become a historical generation, rejecting the trap of inevitability and eternity that older generations have laid before them. One thing is certain, if young people do not begin to make history, politics of eternity and inevitability will destroy it. And to make history, young Americans and Europeans will have to know some. This is not the end, but a beginning. The time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right, thus Hamlet. Yet he concludes, nay, come, let's go together.